All right, everybody, get ready because today we are diving deep, deep into the world of hematology.
The stuff that, keeps us going.
Literally. And you listeners have sent in some really fascinating excerpts from Dr. Clarkson's medical lecture notes.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, and whether you are, currently prepping for a big exam, maybe you're knee deep in a research project,
Right.
or hey, maybe you're just curious about what's going on in those veins of yours, I think we're going to uncover some real gems today.
Dr. Clarkson's notes they're really something. He's incredibly thorough, and he's got this way of explaining even the most complex stuff in a way that just makes it stick.
He's a bit of a legend in the field, from what I hear.
You could tell he just loves hematology.
Yeah, the passion is there. All right, so we've got these lecture notes, and let me tell you, they are packed.
Yeah.
Jam-packed.
We're talking everything from, the subtle signs of anemia to the, crazy cascade of events that happen when you get a paper cut. So where do we even begin?
Well, I think Dr. Clarkson, he really focuses on three main areas. We've got your red blood cell disorders, and then we're talking those bleeding disorders. Always fun.
Oh, yeah?
And then, of course, white blood cell disorders. And, maybe a good place to start is anemia. I mean, let's face it, most of us have at least, encountered it at some point.
Anemia. Yeah, it's like the common cold of blood disorders, right?
Right.
You hear it everywhere. But I have to admit, I don't really know what it is. I always thought it was just not having enough iron.
Well, it often involves iron, that's true. But Dr. Clarkson, he defines anemia as having fewer red blood cells than normal, or not having enough hemoglobin in those cells.
Okay. And hemoglobin, remember, that's the protein that carries oxygen.
Yeah, high school bio way back when.
Exactly. So basically with anemia, your body is just not getting enough oxygen.
Interesting. So it's like an oxygen delivery issue. And that can, I mean, I imagine that can manifest in a lot of different ways.
Oh, absolutely. Dr. Clarkson, he does a great job of kind of going through those symptoms from the more mild ones, fatigue, we've all been there,
Oh, yeah.
feeling a little pale, to the more serious stuff like chest pain, even fainting.
This is making me think about a while back, I was feeling so drained all the time. And my hands, my feet, always freezing. Turns out it was low iron. I had no idea that something as simple as iron could have such a big impact.
It's amazing how these little things, they can really throw things off. And you're right, iron deficiency, it's a big cause of anemia. But here's the thing, not all anemias are the same.
Right. Of course, there's got to be different types, right?
Exactly. Dr. Clarkson, he dives into all these different classifications for anemia, using things like MCV, MCH, MCHC. Might sound a little like alphabet soup,
A little bit.
but they're like these clues. They help pinpoint exactly what's going on with your red blood cells.
Clues, I like that. So it's like we're solving a medical mystery, and these blood tests are like our evidence.
Exactly. Like MCV, for example, that measures the size of your red blood cells. Are they too big, too small, or just right?
Okay.
Then you have MCH, MCHC, which look at how much hemoglobin is packed into those cells.
So it's not just about the number of cells, but what's actually inside them, too.
Exactly. And get this, Dr. Clarkson, he uses this analogy. He compares MCH to the weight of a student's backpack. And MCHC, that's how tightly packed that backpack is.
Okay, that's a good one.
Right. Heavy backpack doesn't always mean it's packed efficiently.
Makes sense. Okay, so we've got all these different types of anemia stemming from problems with red blood cells, but what's actually causing those problems in the first place?
So Dr. Clarkson breaks these causes down into three main buckets. Blood loss, which seems pretty straightforward.
If you're losing blood, you're losing those red blood cells, yeah.
Right. But there's actually some nuance even there. He talks about anemia of acute blood loss, so that's like a sudden loss of blood, maybe after an injury, or even some internal bleeding from an ulcer.
Okay, so that's like a sudden drop.
Exactly. And then there's anemia of chronic blood loss.
Yeah.
And that's more of a slow, steady leak.
Oh, interesting.
Could be something like heavy periods or even, microscopic bleeding in the GI tract. Actually pretty common, especially as we get older.
That's like the slow leak you mentioned earlier. It sneaks up on you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because it's so gradual, a lot of times people don't even realize they're anemic until the symptoms get really noticeable.
And speaking of symptoms, I noticed that Dr. Clarkson, he mentioned a pretty unusual one associated with iron deficiency anemia. Pica. Ever heard of that?
Yes, pica. That's when people crave things that, well, aren't actually food.
But
We're talking ice, dirt, sometimes even paper.
wait, dirt? Seriously?
Yeah, it sounds strange, but it's thought to be the body trying to, I don't know, get those essential nutrients it's missing, like iron.
Wow. The things you learn. He also mentioned something called koilonychia.
Koilonychia. It's a mouthful, but basically means spoon-shaped nails. Another sign of iron deficiency.
You know, my grandmother, she always had those really thin, concave nails. I had no idea that could be related to iron.
You just never know. It's amazing what our bodies reveal if we're paying attention. Okay, but let's shift gears for a second. Let's talk about another category. Macrocytic anemias.
Macrocytic. So we're thinking big cells here.
You got it. Macrocytic anemias, that's when those red blood cells, they're larger than normal. And this is where we learn that bigger isn't always better.
Interesting.
Right. In this case, those oversized red blood cells, they're often a sign of deficiencies in either vitamin B12 or folate, also known as vitamin B9.
B12 and folate, those are both super important, right? For like cell growth and all that.
Absolutely. And when you don't have enough, it can cause a whole cascade of problems, including these big kind of immature red blood cells that don't do their job as well as they should.
And I know that B12 deficiency, specifically, that one can really mess with your brain, right? I noticed Dr. Clarkson even used the term altered mental status, which sounds a little scary, to be honest.
Yeah, it can be serious. Without enough B12, your nerve function gets impaired, so you can have problems with balance, memory, even mood swings.
So it's not just feeling tired, it can actually impact how you think.
Exactly, which is why it's so important to catch it early. And you know what's fascinating? Dr. Clarkson, he points out this connection between B12, B9 deficiency and high homocysteine levels.
Homocysteine. That rings a bell, but remind me.
It's linked to heart health.
Wait, so a deficiency in those vitamins could mean a higher risk of heart disease.
It's a connection a lot of people don't realize, but it's there. Now, here's another interesting thing. B12 and folate deficiency, they both lead to macrocytic anemia, but there's a key difference. Folate deficiency, you don't see those same neurological effects.
So even though they might look similar on the surface, they have very different implications.
Exactly. Speaking of different sides to the same coin, let's talk about sickle cell anemia for a minute.
Sickle cell, okay, yeah, that one always stuck with me. The red blood cells are like literally sickle-shaped.
Exactly. It's a genetic disorder where the red blood cells, instead of being nice and round, they take on this sickle shape. And this is actually a great example of how even traits that seem negative can sometimes have an upside.
Wait, an upside to sickle-shaped cells? How does that work?
Well, it turns out that people who carry one copy of the sickle cell gene, so they don't have the full-blown disease, they could pass it on to their kids, they actually have some protection against malaria.
Malaria, wow. Okay, that is not what I was expecting.
Right.
How does that even work?
So it seems like those sickle-shaped cells, while they can cause a lot of other problems, they make it harder for that malaria parasite to infect the red blood cells and really, like, take hold.
Fascinating. So it's like this, I don't know, weird evolutionary trade-off, right?
Exactly.
You get this protection, but you also might pass this disorder on. Man, nature is wild.
Absolutely. And this whole dance between, like, risk and benefit, it pops up everywhere in hematology. You know, take blood clots, for example. On the one hand, clots are essential, right? They keep us from bleeding out from a paper cut. But on the other hand, too much clotting, that can be really dangerous.
It's all about balance, like so many things in life. Which brings us to, well, hemostasis, that whole process of stopping bleeding. And I love this. Dr. Clarkson uses this analogy.
Oh, yeah, the construction crew, right?
The construction crew. I love it because it takes this super complex process and it makes it like so easy to picture. So walk us through. We've got our construction crew. They show up at the site. There's a pothole in the road.
Okay, so the pothole, in this case, that's our damaged blood vessel.
Right. Makes sense.
The first phase is vasospasm, and that's like the crew setting up those traffic cones, right? Redirecting the traffic around the pothole.
Yeah.
That blood vessel, it constricts, narrows the opening, reduces that blood flow to the area.
Okay, so first things first, we got to contain the damage.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Then come the platelets. Those are our hardworking construction workers.
Love it.
They swarm to the injury, they stick together, form a platelet plug to try and temporarily seal up that opening.
Okay, so we've slowed down the traffic, and now we're slapping a temporary patch on that pothole. What's next?
Next up is coagulation. This is where a more stable clot gets formed, like the crew laying down that new asphalt, you know, making it a permanent fix.
Okay.
This phase, it involves a whole cascade of reactions. But the end result is this soluble protein, fibrinogen, it gets converted into these insoluble fibrin threads.
And those are what actually make up that, like, mesh-like structure of the clot, right?
Exactly. It's pretty incredible how it all comes together. And Dr. Clarkson points out that there's this one factor Von Willebrand factor.
Yeah.
It plays a really important role here.
Okay, von Willebrand factor. That's ringing a bell, but it can't quite place it. What makes it so special?
Think of von Willebrand factor as like the glue that holds everything together. It helps those platelets stick to the damaged blood vessel, helps them stick to each other, lets that initial platelet plug actually form. Without it, the platelets they can't do their job.
So it's like the foreman of the construction crew, making sure everybody's on the same page. And speaking of things that can like throw a wrench into this whole process, aspirin.
Oh, yeah.
I know Dr. Clarkson mentions that aspirin can actually affect how our blood clots.
That's right. Aspirin, it inhibits this enzyme called COX-1. And COX-1 plays a role in making something called thromboxane A2.
Thromboxane A2? I'm not even going to try.
You don't have to.
Yeah.
The important thing to remember is that thromboxane A2, it activates platelets. Basically tells them, hey, time to clump together.
Right, yeah.
And aspirin, it stops that from happening.
Uh-huh. So it makes the platelets less sticky.
You got it.
That's why they tell people to take a low-dose aspirin, to help prevent heart attacks and strokes. It all goes back to preventing those dangerous blood clots.
Exactly. It's really amazing when you understand this stuff at like the molecular level. It can really change how we approach health.
Totally. Okay, so we've talked about vasospasm, platelet plug formation. Now let's dive into that last part, the coagulation cascade.
Ah, yes,
Okay, yeah.
cascade. It's often shown as this like big waterfall of factors. And honestly, it can seem a little intimidating.
A little intimidating. That's an understatement. I still have flashbacks to biochem class trying to memorize all those pathways.
It's a lot. We don't have to get into all the nitty-gritty details here.
Mm-hmm.
The main takeaway is that there are two main paths. You've got the intrinsic pathway and the extrinsic pathway. And they both, eventually, they converge. They have the same goal, which is to produce fibrin that makes up that mesh-like network we were talking about.
So two separate paths, but the same destination, like those choose-your-own-adventure books, but for blood clotting.
I love that. That's great. And it's fitting because those two pathways, they represent different ways of kicking off that clotting cascade.
Okay, how so?
The intrinsic pathway, that gets triggered by things within the blood itself. And then the extrinsic pathway, that one is initiated by factors outside the blood, like tissue factor that gets released from damaged tissues.
So internal damage versus external damage?
Exactly. But both of them, eventually they lead to the activation of this one really important player, factor X. And that's where things really get going.
Okay, so factor X, that's like the tipping point.
Exactly. Once factor X is activated, it sets off this whole chain reaction.
Hmm.
Prothrombin gets converted to thrombin, and then thrombin converts fibrinogen to fibrin, our star player when it comes to clot formation. Dr. Clarkson, he also points out two other players here, often overlooked, vitamin K and calcium.
Wait, really? I thought it was mostly about having enough platelet.
Nope, your diet matters too.
Interesting.
Vitamin K, that's crucial for actually making those clotting factors. And calcium, that acts as a cofactor in a lot of these reactions.
Huh. So if you're low on either of those, it can really mess things up.
Exactly.
Wow, this just reminds me, like, how interconnected our bodies really are. I mean, everything from the food we eat to these, like, tiny cascades happening at a cellular level. It's amazing. But, of course, with any complex system, things can go wrong.
Totally, and that's where we start to see those bleeding disorders and clotting disorders.
Right, exactly. And Dr. Clarkson's notes, he goes into a lot of detail about some of the more common ones. Hemophilia, for example.
Oh, yes, classic example of a genetic bleeding disorder.
And it mostly affects males, right?
Right, it's X-linked recessive. So females, they've got two X chromosomes.
Okay.
So even if they inherit one copy of that mutated gene, they usually have a second healthy copy to pick up the slack.
Yeah.
But males, they only have the one X chromosome. So if they inherit that mutated gene, that's it.
Kind of a tough break for them.
It is. And there are a couple of different types of hemophilia depending on which clotting factor is deficient. Hemophilia A, that's the most common type, involves factor VIII. Hemophilia B is a deficiency in factor IX.
And because they have those deficiencies, their blood doesn't clot properly.
Right, they can have excessive bleeding, even from really minor injuries.
I remember reading somewhere that even, like, brushing their teeth can be dangerous for people with severe hemophilia.
Yeah, and Dr. Clarkson mentions that a lot of times that bleeding, it happens internally, into the joints and muscles, which can be incredibly painful.
And lead to long-term damage, too, I imagine.
Yeah.
Wow. So, challenging to live with, to say the least. He also talks about von Willebrand disease, which he says is actually more common than hemophilia.
It is. But it flies under the radar a lot of the time because it can be so mild. A lot of people might not even know they have it. They
Interesting.
just bruise easily or have, slightly heavier periods than usual. But for some people, it can be pretty severe.
He mentions that the symptoms can be all over the place, and diagnosing it usually involves this test called the ristocetin cofactor assay.
It's true. Symptoms can be tricky. And unlike hemophilia, which is almost always caused by, a genetic mutation,
Okay.
von Willebrand disease, that can actually be acquired later in life. Sometimes it's because of another medical condition, sometimes even certain medications.
There's always more to it, isn't there?
Always. Okay, ready for this next one? This one's straight out of a medical thriller. DIC, disseminated intravascular coagulation.
Whoa, what was that last part?
I know, it's a mouthful, right?
Yeah.
And it's as serious as it sounds. DIC is this condition where your body's clotting and bleeding mechanisms, they both kind of go haywire at the same time.
Wait, so you're clotting too much in some places and bleeding too much in others? That doesn't even seem possible. How does that even happen?
It seems counterintuitive,
Mm.
but it all goes back to that balance in the coagulation cascade, right?
Right.
Like we were talking about before. It's like that balance gets thrown totally out of whack.
Okay.
Dr. Clarkson uses this analogy. He calls it a runaway train.
A runaway train. Okay, that's a scary image.
It is. And it's a good one because DIC, it can be really dangerous,
Hmm.
often triggered by things like severe infections, trauma, even certain cancers.
He even links it to sepsis, which I know is no joke.
You're right, sepsis is a huge risk factor for DIC. And because it involves both the clotting and bleeding, the symptoms can be really all over the place and often look like other conditions.
Tricky.
It is tricky. You might see bruising, bleeding from like your gums,
Yeah.
IV sites.
Right.
But then at the same time, all that clotting can cause organ damage.
Oh, wow. Because the blood flow is compromised.
Exactly.
So it's a tough one to diagnose, tough one to manage.
For sure.
Okay, so we've tackled red blood cell disorders. We've gone through all those bleeding and clotting disorders, those intricate cascades. Are you ready to move on to our final frontier here?
Get me.
White blood cell disorders.
All right. White blood cells, those are like the warriors of our immune system, defending us from all those invaders.
It's like our own personal army.
Exactly. And just like with any army, sometimes things go wrong.
Right, and that's when we see these disorders pop up.
Exactly. And Dr. Clarkson, he starts off this section with a pretty sobering statistic. He says that 1 in 70 people will develop leukemia in their lifetime.
1 in 70. Wow, that's a lot higher than I would have thought.
It is. It really highlights how important it is to understand these diseases. And it's not just one disease. It's actually a whole group of cancers that affect the bone marrow and blood.
Right. He talks about acute versus chronic leukemia, which I know has to do with how quickly the disease progresses.
Exactly. Think of acute leukemias like a flash flood. Sudden onset, rapid progression. Chronic leukemias, those are more like a slow leak, developing over time. And within each of those categories, you've got different types based on which type of white blood cell is being, a little bit naughty.
Okay, so it's not just the speed, but also which specific cells are involved. And I imagine that's really important for determining the best course of treatment, right?
You got it. Understanding those differences, that's crucial for how each type of leukemia gets diagnosed, how it's treated, and ultimately the prognosis.
So let's break it down then, starting with the acute leukemias. What are some of the key things to know about AML, acute myeloid leukemia?
So AML, that one tends to affect adults, and the risk just goes up as we age. Dr. Clarkson also mentions that prior chemo or radiation, those are risk factors as well.
Makes sense, considering those treatments can be tough on the bone marrow.
Exactly. And another thing about AML, when they look at the cells under the microscope, there's this unique characteristic that helps with diagnosis. Our rods. They look like these tiny little rods or needles inside the cells.
Our rods? Okay, I'll just take your word for it on that one.
You don't have to worry about recognizing them. Just know that they're helpful for the hematologists.
Gotcha.
Now, this next part's a little bit heavier. ALL, or acute lymphocytic leukemia. That's the most common cancer in kids and teenagers.
Oh, wow. That's really tough.
It is. And while there are a lot of different subtypes of ALL, the good news is that with all the treatments available now, chemo, stem cell transplants, these targeted therapies, the long-term survival rate for kids with ALL is actually really good.
Okay, that's good to hear. There's a lot of hope there.
There is. So are we ready to move on to the chronic leukemias? They tend to be a little sneakier.
Yeah, let's do it. What makes them so sneaky?
Well, chronic leukemias, they can develop so slowly that people often don't even have symptoms for years.
Oh, wow. So they might not even know they have it until it's pretty advanced.
Sometimes it's found totally by chance. just during routine blood work,
Wow, so it's really important to stay on top of those checkups.
for sure. But even though they're slow growing, if they're not treated, chronic leukemias can still cause some serious problems. Dr. Clarkson, he lists out some of the common symptoms to watch out for. Things like fatigue, no appetite, and enlarged spleen. Those are all signs that those abnormal white blood cells are starting to crowd out all the healthy cells in the bone marrow.
Okay, so what are the different types of chronic leukemia? I know we've got CLL and CML, but are there others?
Those are definitely the most common.
Yeah.
CLL, chronic lymphocytic leukemia, that one's the most common type in adults overall. And like I was saying earlier, it's often found just by chance during those routine blood tests.
So it's kind of a silent disease, at least in the beginning.
In a way, yeah.
Okay, what about CML, chronic myelogenous leukemia?
CML, that one's really interesting because it's often linked to this very specific genetic abnormality, the Philadelphia chromosome.
The Philadelphia chromosome. Okay, yeah, I've heard of that, but I don't really know what it means.
Well, it's actually a result of a translocation. That's when two chromosomes swap little bits of their DNA. And in the case of CML, it's chromosomes 9 and 22 that do the swapping. And when they swap, they create this fusion gene. And that fusion gene, that's what drives the overproduction of white blood cells.
So this like tiny little genetic change can have this huge ripple effect.
It really is incredible. And in terms of how CML progresses, Dr. Clarkson, he lays out three main phases. First, there's the chronic phase, which is usually when it's diagnosed. Then you've got the accelerated phase where things start to get a bit more, well, aggressive.
Yeah.
And then finally, there's the blast crisis phase. And that one is the most serious, most life-threatening stage.
The blast crisis phase, that sounds intense. It almost sounds like it morphs into a different type of leukemia.
You're not wrong. It's characterized by this rapid increase in those immature white blood cells, kind of similar to what we see in AML.
So it's like the disease reverts to a more aggressive form.
Yeah, you could say that. But, and this is a big but, with these new targeted therapies, especially one called imatinib, which specifically goes after the protein that's produced by that Philadelphia chromosome, a lot of people with CML are living much longer, healthier lives.
Wow, that's amazing. It really speaks to how far we've come in terms of understanding and treating these diseases. Okay, shifting gears a bit, I want to make sure we have time to talk about multiple myeloma.
Good one. So that one's a bit different because it involves our pals, the plasma cells.
Plasma cells, those are the ones that produce antibodies,
You
right?
got it, the heavy artillery of the immune system.
But with multiple myeloma, those antibody factories, they go rogue.
They do. In multiple myeloma, a single plasma cell becomes cancerous and just starts churning out tons of useless copies of the same antibody.
So instead of a diverse army of antibodies, you have this one rogue factory just mass-producing defective weapons.
That's a great way to put it. And those defective antibodies, they're called M proteins. They can cause a whole bunch of problems like clogging up the kidneys, messing with the production of normal blood cells, and even weakening the bones.
Wait, weakening bones? What's the connection there?
Well, the myeloma cells, they release these substances that activate these cells called osteoclasts. And osteoclasts, their job is to break down bone tissue.
Ah, so they're like the demolition crew of the bone world.
Exactly. And all that bone breakdown, that can lead to pain, fractures, and even hypercalcemia, which is high calcium in the blood.
Hypercalcemia. Yeah, doesn't that cause all sorts of strange symptoms?
It does. Dr. Clarkson, he actually includes this mnemonic in his notes for remembering them. Bones, stones, groans, moans, psychiatric overtone.
Moans, stones, groans, moans. Okay, it's a mouthful, but I have to admit, it's pretty catchy.
It sticks with you, right? And it really illustrates how far-reaching those effects of multiple myeloma can be.
For sure. So diagnosing it, it sounds like that can involve a lot of different tests.
It does. Blood tests, urine tests, bone marrow biopsies, a whole shebang.
This is heavy stuff. Okay, are we ready to tackle our last category here, the malignant lymphomas?
Let's do it.
All right, so we're talking Hodgkin and non-Hodgkin lymphoma.
Yep, and as Dr. Clarkson points out, non-Hodgkin lymphoma, that's actually the most common type of blood cancer in the U.S.
Really? Wow, I had no idea. So what are we talking about when we say Hodgkin versus non-Hodgkin? I know they both involve lymphocytes, but what makes them different?
You're right, they both involve lymphocytes. The big difference is the specific type of lymphocyte that goes rogue, so to speak. In Hodgkin lymphoma, it's this very specific type of B cell, a Reed-Sternberg cell.
Reed-Sternberg cell. Okay, I think I remember that from my biology class.
They're the hallmark of Hodgkin lymphoma. They've got this distinct look under the microscope, almost like owl's eyes.
Owl's eyes. Okay, now I'll definitely remember that. So finding those Reed-Sternberg cells, that's key for diagnosing Hodgkin lymphoma. What about non-Hodgkin lymphoma?
With non-Hodgkin, it can be any type of lymphocyte. And there are a lot of subtypes, each with its own characteristics and, its own prognosis.
And in general, non-Hodgkin's a bit tougher to treat than Hodgkin lymphoma.
Yeah, sadly it is. The treatments have gotten a lot better for both types, but non-Hodgkin lymphoma tends to be more aggressive, and there's a higher chance of it coming back.
Dr. Clarkson mentions something called painless lymphadenopathy. He says that's a common symptom of both types.
It is. Lymphadenopathy, that's just a fancy way of saying you've got swollen lymph nodes.
Right, and that can happen anywhere in the body, but it's often noticed first in the neck, armpits, or groin.
Exactly. It's like our body's way of saying, hey, something's up here.
And with lymphoma, that something is the uncontrolled growth of those lymphocytes. Speaking of uncontrolled growth, there's one more type of lymphoma I want to make sure we touch on before we wrap up. Burkitt lymphoma.
Oh, Burkitt lymphoma.
Hmm.
Now that one is aggressive. Grows super fast.
And it's more common in certain parts of the world, right?
You got it. It's actually more common in children than adults, and it's particularly prevalent in parts of Africa. Dr. Clarkson, he points to a couple key things that seem to be linked to it. A specific gene translocation and the Epstein-Barr virus.
Epstein-Barr virus. Isn't that the one that causes mono?
The one and only. Pretty amazing, huh? One virus can cause everything from something as, I don't know, relatively minor as mono to something as serious as Burkitt lymphoma.
It's like the viral equivalent of a wolf in sheep's clothing.
That's a great way to put it.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. I mean, we've gone from the basics of red blood cells and white blood cells to all these complex and honestly sometimes pretty scary disorders that can happen when things go wrong.
We've only just skinned the surface, really. But we've touched on so many important points. Anemia, those bleeding and clotting disorders, white blood cell disorders. Dr. Clarkson really covers it all.
It's incredible how this one tiny cell, the blood cell, it really does hold the key to so much. It really is amazing. We take our blood for granted. But when you stop and think about everything it does, I mean, it's transporting oxygen, fighting infections, repairing those injuries. It's incredible.
It really is. And any well-oiled machine, it needs all its parts to work together, right?
Yeah.
And when that harmony gets disrupted, things can go south pretty quickly,
Yeah.
as we've seen.
For sure, for sure. So for our listeners out there soaking all of this up, what would you say is the most important thing to remember from all of this?
Oh, that's a great question. I think if I had to pick just one thing, it would be to pay attention to your body.
Okay, I like that.
We've talked about so many different disorders, some common, some not so common, but they all underscore this point. Your body's always sending you signals.
Right, like those subtle signs of anemia we talked about, the fatigue, the paleness, the cold hands.
Yes, exactly. It's so easy to just brush those things off. Oh, I'm just tired. I'm just getting older. But sometimes those seemingly small things, they can be a sign of something bigger. So yeah, listen to your body. And don't be afraid to advocate for yourself. If something feels off, don't ignore it.
That is such good advice. And honestly, that applies to so much more than just hematology. Well said. All right, well, I think we have successfully navigated the intricate and sometimes very strange world of blood. Thanks for joining us on this wild ride. Until next time, stay curious.